So, we are gonna get into the 14th installment of our ongoing miniseries on the Insurrection Act. Moving right along with it, and of course, moving right into modern times. A little bit scary. Ooh. Yeah, turns out definitely can happen today. And there's a lot of really scary precedents that allow them to do some shit y'all ain't gonna like if they ever figure this out. So picture this. It's Hurricane Hugo, St. Croix, and 1989 Virgin Islands deployment. So a hurricane tears through the American islands, shreds homes and infrastructure, it knocks out normal communications, it leaves terrified residents just trapped in the dark. And the real nightmare starts. The looting spreads. Local order starts collapsing. Reports say people who are even supposed to maintain order are overwhelmed. And for the last times in American history, the president reaches for one of the bluntest tools in the federal toolbox, the Insurrection Act. In September of 1989, Hurricane Hugo slammed into the Caribbean and hit St. Croix with a devastating force. The storm didn't damage just buildings, it shattered the system, made ordinary life possible. Power was gone, communications was crippled, supplies were uncertain, fear spread fast, and the chaos that followed, looting and disorder, broke out across St. Croix. This was not a classic rebellion against Washington. It was something more unsettling in its own way. Domestic disorder born of disaster, desperation, and institutional breakdown. See, a lot of people hear Insurrection Act and immediately think of civil rights showdowns, riots, or armed resistance. The Virgin Islands case reminds us of the laws broader than the name makes it sound. The act can be used when domestic violence or disorder obstruct the execution of laws and the local authorities cannot restore order on their own. In St. Croix, the federal government concluded that the threshold had been crossed. So on September 20th, 1989, President H.W. Bush issued Proclamation 6023. In it, he said conditions of domestic violence and disorder existed in and about the Virgin Islands, that life and property were endangered, and that the local law enforcement resources available to the territory, including the National Guard, were unable to suppress the violence and restore law and order. That same day, Bush issued an Executive Order 12690, authorizing units and the members of the armed forces of the United States to suppress violence and restore order in and about the Virgin Islands. In plain English, the president formally declared the breakdown serious enough that federal troops could be used inside American territory to restore order. Once the legal machinery was in motion, federal forces were deployed to St. Croix. Their role was not ordinary disaster relief. This was not passing out water and clearing roads. This was about reestablishing control. The point of the deployment was to stop the violence, protect life and property, secure federal functions, and create enough stability for civilian government to get its footing back. That distinction matters. Plenty of disasters bring in military under other authorities. The Insurrection Act is different because it opens the door for military involvement in law enforcement when the crisis is considered beyond the capacity of civilian authorities. Now, this example reminds us that the Insurrection Act is not just a war powers relic collecting dust on the legal attic. It's a live emergency authority that can appear whenever the president decides ordinary systems have broken down badly enough. And that should make people uneasy for two reasons. First, sometimes a real crisis absolutely does overwhelm the local institutions. Second, the law gives the president a huge amount of discretion when it comes to that line being crossed. The Virgin Islands deployment may look justified by the facts, but it also shows how much authority is concentrated in one office once the magic words, domestic violence, disorder, and inability to execute the laws, are invoked. So order was restored, but the episode left behind bigger questions than just whether the troops did their job. Why did the collapse of St. Croix become so severe? Why were local institutions unable to contain it faster? And what does it say about the structure of emergency response when the natural disaster can turn a law and order crisis requiring federal troops? That is the part people tend to forget. The soldiers are the dramatic image. Real stories are often the institutional failure that made the deployment possible in the first place. This episode is not about blue versus red or north versus south or even one mob against another. It's about what happens when a disaster strips away that thin layer of normalcy and exposes how fragile public order can be. In 1989, Hurricane Hugo battered St. Croix. The looting and disorder that followed pushed President H.W. Bush to invoke the Insurrection Act and send in federal troops. It was one of the last times the laws was actually used. And like every other entry in the series, it leaves us with another uncomfortable truth. Once leaders decide civil order has collapsed, the distance between civilian government military force can get very short, very fast. All right, folks. That is going to do it for this segment on the Insurrection Act. I hope y'all enjoyed. I hope y'all keep watching.